microbes on more ecosystem level responses, and especially looking at some of big global changes that we have coming down the pipeline, especially climate change. So I had to say that because that's not what she's going to be talking about today at all. So, so you know what she really does. Today, Dr. Gutknecht is going to be talking about Kernza, perennial grain, and a large CAP project in which she's been involved over the last few years. So I'm really excited to hear about it because I know very little. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I think that I have, we'll see where we go here. I have a singular data slide, and it is not even my own data. So we'll see where we go. So, yep. So, oh, wait a second. Oh, and that's funny. My first slide didn't seem to show up. So I'm going to start us with a question. Why, and this is a bit of a teasing you in the horticulture department also. So why do we make new crops? Like, who needs another apple variety? Like, or a new, like, yeah, like, why do we, you know, there are a lot of, like, the money spent with breeding and crop development of new versions of things we even already grow, let alone like a totally brand new crop. Like, why do we do that? Because what we have isn't perfect. Yeah. In what ways is it not perfect?
Well, it depends on the product. I mean, it depends on the crop, but none of our crops are perfect. For sure. And none of the cultivars in our crops are perfect.
Or sometimes to fit into a new system.
Yeah.
The breeding of crops that, for organic systems, they're breeding crops that are specifically of use in systems that are managed differently.
Yeah, so as we develop management, or as there's an innovation over here, we might need to shift the crops over here. And I know there are a lot of people on Zoom. So Kelsey, or can you help me with, I think there's one chat. Yeah, if anyone wants to chime in on Zoom also.
The chat comment was that people on Zoom would like the comments in the room to be repeated because they're not being picked up by the microphone.
Oh.
So when somebody in the room says something, if you can just, you know, quickly summarize what they said, that would be helpful to those of us out here.
Oh, that's good to know. So yeah, so the two big comments so far were that the things we have aren't perfect, and then Julie played off of that not only are they not perfect, but it's a moving target. Because if we change management, or if a different situation changes, we might want to develop a new crop that matches that situation better. So thanks, Adrian. Yeah, is there any other, I think there's a comment in the, oh, that was just to repeat back. Okay. Yeah, what are some other, I would even take that a step further, that our whole, you know, Julie was mentioning that I do a lot of work on climate change. And so our whole world is changing. Does that mean that we need new crops or new varieties? So the next step, like if you want to make a new crop, and what steps do you need to take? Like, how do you get it out there?
It needs to have some use for somebody eventually.
So it has to have some use for someone eventually. Was that a good repeat of what you said? So it has to be useful. So that goes into the breeding process, right? Because we have to make something that's useful. What else do we need? It has to be more, someone has to buy it. Yeah, someone has to buy it.
It has to have value.
It has to have value.
It has either direct value that they buy, or ecosystem service value that they value, something.
Yeah, so there has to be something, and
some incentive for somebody to grow it.
Yeah, some incentive. So maybe someone other than you had to think that what was already available was imperfect. So someone had to buy it. And I am kind of, as I interact, I am like repeating what people are saying. And if there's something in chat, or in the Q&A, yeah, that would be great. So yeah, so you have to create a market if there isn't already one. You have to tell people there's a new fancy this that you should try. Or like, why have you not been doing the best? And that's an interesting situation because, you know, consumer, yeah, and everything about like you mentioned, environmental incentives or ecosystem service incentives, for example, and those are really hard to put a number on. But is it worthy of, or is it worthy of making evaluation for things that we want to develop or that we have? Yeah, exactly. And so Kernza is kind of this new up and coming perennial grain crop, but the idea of perennialization, I'll take a step back from that before I introduce it, is environmental quality in food systems. And I have some local examples. So Minnesota rural municipalities often spend more than $1,000 per household in mitigating nitrate. Our cropping systems are facing increasing risk of erosion, loss of soil, climate change is affecting our food systems. And there are all these issues of, you know, and we can't necessarily solve those by ourselves, but food inequities and producing enough food to get to people who to eat it. And one of the conceptual frameworks that people can use around this is called sustainable or ecological intensification. Has anyone heard of that in my audience of 4 people? Yeah. So the idea is that the broadest idea is to make more out of the land that we have. And there are a lot of different debates and ways that you can do that. And I'll share a couple of the main lines of thought that have stemmed from this. But the idea is that you increase the use of what you're putting on the land. So if you're putting on inputs or you're managing in a certain way, are you doing it with the most efficiency and the most conservation in mind? Are you maintaining ecosystem services and biodiversity as you farm and move onto landscapes? Are you maximizing environmental value? You know, minimizing trade-offs, accelerating the rate of change as you move into national and international markets. So this is the kind of broadest definition of sustainable intensification. The way that a lot of people have kind of co-opted, I would even say, this term is by something that looks like this. And so you still have something that's better, but it looks an awful lot like our current row cropping systems. So maybe you're trying to reduce inputs or you're trying to improve the efficiency of the nutrients you put on. In some versions of this are actually putting on like more nitrogen or more inputs in order to boost yields in a certain small place. You're then improving, you know, water use and soil life that's representative of this little goofy thing. And so again, like you're doing more with the land that we have, but it looks similar. And the kind of paradigm shift that I'm really interested in and that this team is really interested in is, you know, this could be a tool and it might be an important tool in some places, but do we need to also kind of see things differently in the face of all of these large environmental challenges? And so this is a paper that came out a couple of years ago on a different way that this could look. And this is a perennial system. And this particular image they had in this is interesting because it still has some annual phases. And you could imagine a world that has or doesn't have those annual cropping systems still there. But if you had a perennial system, you're really reducing, not only are you reducing or maximizing the use of inputs, but you're reducing soil disturbance because you have something that's going to fill in and, you know, and prevent weeds and use more of the soil for nutrients, develop a rooting base that's going to develop the soil and hold those nutrients more. And so this is kind of upping the ante on this idea of sustainable intensification. And that brings me to Kernza. One of the reasons this is the plant is called intermediate wheatgrass. It was actually brought to the US from the Fertile Crescent as a forage crop. And what's interesting about it, or why people start to see promise in it, is that it has relatively large seeds for a perennial grass. And so the kind of potential for breeding was already there. It has a really deep, dense root system that I find beautiful. It also tolerates a wide range of temperature precipitation patterns. And so it just checked a lot of boxes for something that could be developed. And so the Rodale Institute and then the Land Institute and the University of Minnesota were the first to take a lot of steps in breeding this crop. This is kind of the current list of those institutes involved in the Kernza breeding. So the Land Institute, University of Minnesota, University of Manitoba, and then the USDA and Kansas State. And Kansas State is especially involved in a lot of the genetics work, as Minnesota is as well. And the University of Minnesota actually released the first variety in 2019. And in a couple more slides, I'll show you, it got the name Minnesota Clearwater, which I'll explain in a couple more slides. And so the increase in seed size and grain yield has been increasing at a really nice pace. So this was the first ingredient. I'm kind of sharing the ingredients that led to this big CAP project. And so over time, there was a good yield increase. I would point out that, so the seed size is increasing 5 to 10% per cycle, and per dollar investment, this is tiny compared to what's invested in the breeding and improvement of major commodity crops. Tiny, tiny amounts of funding. And so this amount of increase is actually still really remarkable. It still yields a lot less than other large commodities, but the progress has been really great. And so now we have a plant that seems promising. It has deep roots. We're getting grain in some kind of quantity. The next thing that happened was that, it showed this remarkable quality to be able to pull nitrate out of the soil. And so now we have, a clear benefit. And I'm showing some of the kind of more established and the most remarkable data. Like now we're starting to publish soil health studies. And this year we're actually starting to undergo a really cool climate adaptation study that we're going to flood the snot out of Kernza. And so a lot of other ecosystem services are coming. There have also been some greenhouse gas studies published with eddy flux towers, but this was the first kind of key, wow, this is really cleaning groundwater. And this is, at least in Minnesota, this is an issue that speaks to a lot of residents. And so with that, all these partnerships and communities started to form. And this is just like a tiny, tiny snapshot. And I have a map over there that shows some of the hotspots for the activity. But there was a big planting in Pipestone Rural Water District that is a wellhead protection area with really high nitrate. And so now all of these community partners could say, you are eating something that's cleaning the water in a county in Minnesota. And the storytelling around that, and the people who were telling this story did a really fantastic job of that. And there are stories that are not mine to tell about schlepping 5-gallon buckets to a brewery or filling a luggage to get it somewhere. So there's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears behind this as well. But the different and diverse partnerships that started to form was something that's been really, and the storytelling that started to happen, I think is something that is really special that we have really capitalized on and are trying to maintain as things get bigger. And so those were the main ingredients that were in place of when we put in this CAP proposal in 2019. And so now I'll get into the Kernza-CAP project. So it's funded in 2020. Probably don't have to tell you that we've gotten this thing off the ground in the middle of a pandemic. But that's a story for another time. It's a $10 million coordinated agricultural project. So this is a large funding arm of USDA. We were actually really amazed because this plus a couple of other grants, the total funding USDA has given to this crop is still probably 15,000 or 15 million around or less. And so to get something of this size was actually really surprising. We have 81 collaborators representing 11 institutions and 41 other entities. And so that's why I showed that slide about all the different partnerships, because they are the reason that it is here. And maintaining those partnerships is the thing that we kind of try to hang on to more than anything else. And so around that, how are we lifting all those things I talked about? Like we still need the breeding, we still need to monitor, we need to develop the markets, as Julie was saying earlier. And so we developed 6 different objectives around this project. This is a snapshot of the partners. It's mostly Midwest, but we have a partner in Davis as well. So we have USGS, Ohio State, University of Wisconsin and Michael Fields Institute in Wisconsin, which is a nonprofit, NDSU, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Kansas University, Kansas State, and the land. And so now I'll kind of step through the different objective groups. So the first is the breeding the genetics. So assessing the agronomic traits, screening new varieties, looking for traits that are related to nutrient composition. Oh, I forgot to mention at the top of each of these objective slides, I've listed the team members because the integration and the team composition was something that was very intentional. So there are food scientists and geneticists and breeders involved in this team. And exploring genetic synergies between traits for agronomic yield and ecosystem services. And so no team gets to play in their own sandbox either. They have to think about how we're lifting all of this thing at the same time. Objective 2 is the farmers, agronomists, and soil scientists. So these are, we have a big fertility trial. We have variety field trials where they're partnering with the genetics team. And these are co-created activities with farmers and the environmental quality team. So a really cool thing that happened around this was kind of late in planning this big fertility trial. There's a farmer partner, Carmen Fernholz, that sits on every single agronomy team meeting every 2 weeks for the last 1.5 years. And at one point, he was like, this kind of isn't what farmers are doing totally. Like you don't have an organic amendment yet. And so now we added a manure, like we added an amendment and we made sure that what we were doing really resonated with him as well. And so the integration at the very deepest levels of this and how different players have integrated has been really exciting. The next objective is agronomists, soil scientists, modelers, industry representatives in the environmental quality team. This is the team that I lead, as well as being on the management team. So monitoring environmental quality from agronomic and breeding trials, validating and modeling climate change and water quality impacts of Kernza cropping systems. And so we're really integrated with the other activities. I didn't list, but we also are engaged with some of the other teams on okay, if we're finding like X% improved soil health or water quality, like how do you, and feeding that to the other teams, like how do you evaluate this? How do you create markets out of this? It's part of the work that we're doing as well. And I'm co-leading this with Alyssa Hartman, who's with the Artisan Grain Collaborative. She's the director. And so we always have this like external voice about what we're doing. Like, is this making sense? How do I bring this to the people that I work with on small grains? And so just to show you a little bit about what this looks like, this is our big fertility trial. So it's a really big, complex trial. We're applying nitrogen at several different levels, but we're also have some checks to manipulate the phosphorus and potassium. And so we decided to continue with a systems approach to this, where we don't have a full range of nitrogen. We're not going to be able to completely determine what's the best nitrogen of these new varieties. We'll get close, but we will also be looking at how does a rate of mineral nitrogen compare to organic nitrogen? What happens if we don't add phosphorus or potassium? And those are nutrients that have been relatively unexplored in Kernza so far. There has been some work kind of pushing the system of it in terms of the nitrogen it can use, but not a lot of other fertility. Like this is really the like baby stages of crop development still. And then what we layered onto this was all of this soil moisture and water quality and soil health work. And one of the things that's going to be interesting, these are the soil health plots, but one of the things that are going to be interesting is that at our highest nitrogen rates, we're going to be testing the water quality. And so, okay, this thing, in certain situations, it can do a really good job of taking nitrate out. But what happens if we push it? What happens if we manage it appropriately to maximize grain yields? Because that's what someone would do. Do we still keep our environmental quality? And so like that kind of realistic check on what we're doing and managing and saying, okay, like, do we have to make trade-offs and say, if we want to go back to ecological intensification, the first idea is, how do we manage that we maintain those, ecological benefits as well? And so that's a kind of an interesting piece. And then we're taking this a step further and saying, okay, like bringing in our modeling and we're actually starting to put together different models on the groundwater and surface water, because this is an approach that USGS has been able to use to look at well water protection. And so if we take our empirical data and feed it into these paired models, can we then take that back to our community partners and talk about well water protection as we did in the beginning of this crop development? And so that's another way that we're kind of weaving a lot of the activities in this grant together. Then to move on to the other objectives. Objective 4 is engaging education, extension, and policy. So this is where we actually, in one objective, we bring in a lot of the important things about CAP, because CAP requires that you merge research, education, and extension. Those are 3 kind of key pillars. And so this is a curriculum development, launching a multi-institution transdisciplinary extension leadership cohort. So bringing in and kind of rethinking the training of extension agents in this type of work, a grower research network, host decision maker educational sessions, and identify kind of the inventory of current conservation policies. So we have someone that's kind of diving into NRCS policy and other incentive programs to see if there's a place that we could start to put perennials into play and look at future policy opportunities. And so they are really leading a lot of work, and they're really doing one of the more remarkable jobs of engaging across the whole project. So, bringing people into the policy discussions, or bringing people into the discussions with policymakers, or getting a lot of us in front of policymakers to tell the story of this work. So that's been some really exciting work as well. The 5th objective is developing supply chain. So this is, again, I forgot to change the top of this. This is the supply chain specialists. Sorry for that typo. So they're facilitating a Kernza Stewards Alliance. So most crops have some kind of like the corn growers or some kind of network that's like specific to the crop. And so this is a Kernza specific Stewards Alliance. And they're doing this in a way of fostering the leadership and maintaining the shared values. They're reviewing payment and marketplace opportunities for incentivizing ecosystem services. And so this is where like my environmental quality team is kind of playing with them and thinking through what incentive programs could look like. And then they're collaborating on the policy program recommendations, because a lot of supply chain and market development has strings behind it of what the policy is, and kind of starting to face the policy hurdles. And I should say, the slide I showed before, like with every look at a policy opportunity, there's a hard look at a policy obstacle that's in this work. Crop insurance is one that we talk about a lot, that prevents a lot of innovation in some ways. So that's a place that we're looking across this work as well. So the most important team, in my opinion, is the center, the integration team, because they're the ones like keeping a check on all of this. Like I've given you a lot of dreamy ideas, but I think everyone knows that when it's time, like, okay, like I just need to make sure everyone takes their soil the right way across 6 institutions. Like I don't have time to talk to the policy person. Like that happens to all of us. And so we have a management team, we have a strong management team, and we have this integration team that's really looking across the project. And so this is the UMN leadership, the Land Institute, and Greenland's Blue Waters leadership. And the work of this is the feedback loops and intentional integration. And I've tried to show that in all the work of the other groups: collective leadership, a blueprint for the next generation, evaluating systems change in emergent learning, and embedding race and equity into our work. And so again, like this is the team that's really thinking across and thinking more broadly. And I wanted to give you all, and I have a couple more slides of the detail of what we're doing, but also to impress the fact that we're seeing this as a model. Like we're trying to kind of tackle all of the parts of developing a new crop at once and pulling them along together. And so could this be, or how could this be a model for crop development in the future? Like how could this, the seeds of these communities and building a market while you're in the very, very primordial stages of developing a crop that actually produces food for people. Like, how do you lift it all together? And that's what this team is tasked with. So those are kind of the nuts and bolts of the team. And I thought I would just show you what we've accomplished so far. And then I'd love to come back to some discussion of like your thoughts on this type of a model for crop development. So our year 1 achievements, probably our most important achievement is that we hired a fantastic project manager, Tara Ritter, because we would not be very far without her. We created data management and race and equity subgroups as well. And so like right away when this, like I said, this got funded in summer of 2020. And we always had written in all of this work about equity in food systems and rural equity. And we were like, but we didn't really put teeth in the project. And so we developed this race and equity subgroup right away. And the race and equity subgroup, as well as the data management group, actually put their heads together. And we created, if anyone's interested, I'm really happy to share this. We created a data, like a structure for publication and data publication in a way that we make sure that across these 70 people, we have a lot of equity built in. Like, we definitely dream of big, exciting synthesis papers, but we want to make sure that every single technician and graduate student is protected also, because they can really get swallowed by these big projects. And so the model that we developed around publication is part of our race and equity work that we are pretty excited about in the first year. And then we did a pretty successful job of carrying out everything in the first year, which was remarkable considering that we were doing it all on Zoom. The other thing that we developed in the first year, this isn't a great slide, but I'm going to read it anyways, is that right away, we like how we're doing it is the important part. And so we developed this set of shared values and principles. I'm not going to read the whole slide, and I can send a PDF of this out if you're interested, but I'll just read the main bullet points. So we're supporting a long-term transformative vision of agriculture that's shared and just. We are scaling Kernza research and activities responsibly to fit a wide range of contexts and needs. We're promoting an open team culture that's supportive, creative, and learning focused. We're prioritizing racial and gender equity throughout the project research, activities, processes. We're building shared leadership and agency into collaborations that are mutually beneficial. And there are also a lot of tools I didn't mention underneath this. And so like we had, for example, when we hired our project manager, we had a very intentional process to from how we recruited, how we judged, how we evaluated candidates, so that that could be a model for because it was the first major hire in the project. And so out of that, we have developed a whole kind of toolbox for everyone else's hires on the project to try to aim for more equity and inclusion. We also are trying really hard to not fool ourselves, because we know that, even if we take some what feel like small steps, we know that these are kind of very visionary things that we're trying to tackle. This is be a little hard to read, but this is a fun thing we had in our first annual report. So this is our year one by the numbers. 16 teacher, researchers, educators, and students interviewed to inform educational models. 603,000, almost 604,000 pounds of Kernza that were harvested in 2021. 623 experimental research plots were put out. Yeah, I have a funny story about that I'm going to tell next. 53 Kernza growers with active trademark licenses. 8 new variety candidates were planted. 3,900 active acres of Kernza production. 2 outreach events to legislators. 133,000 genetic data points collected. 500 soil samples taken. You could guess with that again, Julie. 25 food products were developed in 2021. 6 new variety candidates were established. There were 5 Kernza-CAP sponsored field days, 120 lysimeters installed across all those field trials. And the groundwork laid for next generation business models and stewardship of a crop in an equitable and just way. And to put some of the faces to this, these are our agronomy and EQ teams across the 6 states, and we put numbers to this in our first year. So the agronomy team, they're agronomists, they're a little nutty, so they meet at 8 a.m. Every 2 weeks for a year. So this was 57 plus pages of meeting notes, 27 meetings, 11 team members, more than 300 person hours. And that is not just the regular Zoom calls. That's the we need to meet on the side to nail out the soil sampling protocol. And then our environmental quality team did not meet quite as early because I am leading it. 57 pages of meeting notes. We made protocols and online video protocols to get out to all these people. 270, still a lot of person hours. And we're developing 3 or 4, this is 3, not 4 on-farm trials, collaborations. Tons and tons, not tons, but many, many hundreds of pounds of seed shipped. So this is kind of the reality of what we were trying to do. And so in these experimental trials, one of the great stories was that, because this got funded in July of 2020. And Kernza needs to get planted in late August or the beginning of September. And so we thought, oh my goodness, we have a month to plan field trials that should go across 6 sites in 4 states, 5 states. How are we going to do this? And we are meeting every week, and we are scrambling, and we are scrambling, and we are scrambling. And all of a sudden, on a certain call, someone was like, do we really have to do this? And everyone breathed this big sigh of relief, and we did not do it. And we planted last fall in a much more thoughtful, relaxed way that allowed for a lot of this cross-sector engagement and dignity of sleep at night and things like that. And so everyone works extremely hard, but we also try to be wise about ourselves when we need to. This is one last slide to show the collaborative team. So we have our 6 objective groups. We have our management structure. We also have an advisory committee. That's a requirement by CAP. And so this is where we've been able to bring in a lot of people who've been doing this work for a really long time, but also a lot of fresh voices as well, and diverse voices. And so, with our equity work, another thing that we did right out the bat was okay, we need a much more diverse advisory team. And we were very grateful that a lot of people we were excited to work with said yes. And so with that, this is kind of our local thanks to the people who are here on the ground in Minnesota, or people that I borrowed slides and stories from. And I'll kick us off with your thoughts. Like, this is still fresh in development. So is this a blueprint that you see holes in, or that you are excited about, or if you have questions about anything that I showed?
So Kevin Edberg had posed a question a few minutes ago regarding your objective 5. So he said it is interesting that objective 5 views the supply chain as being policy driven. Market price or market substitution is not identified specifically as a component. Perfectly legitimate, and it's and a market of its own, but this requires a very different orientation to comparisons to the competitive market-based system used in other crops / commodities / models. That isn't exactly addressing your question, but I thought since this was raised a little while ago that maybe we could get to it first.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. It's
It's
really
in the
hard to see
chat
chat
if
while
you
I'm
need to read again, but
yeah, it's super hard to see chat while I'm talking. So should I reread the question to you all also?
Why don't, maybe.
Yeah, can I just,
Can get it hooked up? So
Yeah.
Okay.
Adrian can ask the question.
We're gonna hook you up to the, I also could just repeat it because there are only 5 of us in the room.
oh, okay. So you're not hearing me on that end, I see. Sorry.
I could hear you, but I also can see the chat now.
Ah, good.
So I called up, oh, there we go. You're on the speakers now, but I can also reread it to us. And I was noting that I had a typo, and I might actually take us back to, yep. I was just gonna pop up all 6 of the objectives together. So Kevin is saying it's interesting that objective 5 uses supply chain as being policy driven. Market price, market substitution is not identified specifically as a component. Perfectly legitimate and a market of its own, but it requires very different orientation and comparisons to the competitive market-based system used in other crops and commodities. And I would say, I think that it is in the middle. And I also, and this is my own opinion, I'm not speaking on behalf of that objective group, but I think it's like, I don't think any commodity is purely market driven. I think that's not, I don't think that's quite true. I think that's a little like, I think that like, if you look at the number of subsidies for commodity crops, like a subsidy is a policy. The Farm Bill is a policy that drives how we think about markets in a very powerful way. And so and I think that I didn't quite speak to objective 5 because they are really focused on markets and market developments, and a huge focus, because it's a huge problem, is the supply chain. This is a different grain. It needs to be dehulled. It needs different processing. Like, I don't think I spoke enough to the supply chain needs themselves, and the fact that there is not really one. It's very primordial. I mean, there is one. There are products on the shelves. Any of you can buy them. There is a supply chain. It is very fragile and developing. And so, but I would kind of push back on you, Kevin, that I think that a lot of this is more policy driven than we might think it is. Emily has a question. Emily Hoover. Why intermediate wheatgrass? There are a number of perennials that could provide a number of ecosystem services, and how does this interface with the conservation reserve program? I think I might not even be the best to answer the why of intermediate wheatgrass. I think the qualities that I showed in the very first slide about it were the ones. It's really deeply rooted in fir grass species. It has bigger seeds, but it's definitely not the only one. And I'm presenting Kernza-CAP today, but there are Like I know Forever Green a lot, and the Land Institute have portfolios of different perennials. Actually, one that I think is having one that is a publication that's kind of in the wings in the next few months is on perennial rice that's coming out of China. And that's going to be really interesting to look at with Kernza as a perennial grain, because Kernza was developed through breeding cycles, and perennial rice is developed through hybridization of annual varieties. And so there are these very two different models of plant species development or improvement that are leading to successful crops. But also Emily's second part of her question, how does this interface with the Conservation Reserve Program? That's a good question. That's actually, I don't have an answer to you, but it's a great question. And I mean, maybe if any of the policy team are on Zoom, they could chime in, but the Conservation Reserve Program is one of the ones that they're specifically looking at for like policy ends. Julie has a question here in the room.
So you talked a little bit about the policy leverage that you're trying to gain, working with NRCS or working with some of these partners for policy changes. But when you mentioned it, you said it was not necessarily for Kernza alone, but for perennial crops. And so it almost seems like the project is a model. You're trying to sell it as a model for other new crops and maybe other perennial crops in particular. What does that look like when you try to sell a perennial crop or promote a perennial crop for policy changes to somebody like NRCS? Like, what are the attributes that you try to convince them of, or why you tell them it's important? How do you frame that argument?
Yeah, so Julie's asking, I'm gonna repeat your question. Yeah, so Julie's asking, like, commenting, and this kind of gets at an interesting point of Emily's question too, like why this specific crop? There are a lot of, and that we're almost using this as like when we describe the policy, we're talking about perennials, not just Kernza. And so what does this mean in the realm of that we're trying to use this as a model for different crops, and how do you describe that to policymakers? And I think part of it is actually promotion of perennials that already exist, like orchards and so I think that's part of it. And there's a lot of triangulation that can happen too. And so this is a grain crop, and so we're promoting it as a kind of a next generation grain crop that needs less inputs, that can stay, you don't have to plant it every year, it stays in the ground. But you can also look at it from the other side. Like here's a forage or a grass crop, like the CRP question. But now, instead of CRP land that maybe is only going to forage or that you're setting aside from production, now you have something that also serves to give grain. And so you can use those different strategies in different situations to talk about this. And there is, I did not talk about this today, but there is a whole kind of arm of the Kernza research that's looking at dual uses of forage and grain production in grass-fed cattle operations. So yeah, that's a big piece of the research too. And so the forage quality of these different varieties is something that is looked at quite a bit too.
We've got a couple of comments on the chat from Aaron Meyer, who I'm assuming is part of your.
Yeah, Aaron was a key candidate person that I was
Okay.
hoping would answer some of this. So
Yeah, so she, one I can read, give you a little break. So Aaron says, "Hi, Kevin. Nice to see," and in quotes, "you here." I'll add to Jessica's response that one reason, and so this is getting back to the objective 5 comments. One reason is that very small scale Kernza is at a very small scale right now. The team is working on developing a variety of systemic entry points. Market subs and supply and demand is coming / growing. So those issues are coming into place, but they're really it sounds like they're creating the whole system right now from scratch. Okay, and then she adds, conservation stewardship program and environmental quality incentives program are the NRCS programs that Kernza-CAP is targeting at this stage. Those cost share practices, those cost share practices are available to producers. I'm not sure I'm getting that sentence correct. We are straddling the tensions of production versus conservation that are inherent in NRCS programs. Do you want to add to that at all?
No, I do not. I think that, or yeah, Erin, do you want to add to that at all? I don't know if people can unmute if we're.
Kelsey might be able to unmute and promote her to a panelist status if that would be helpful.
Yeah,
But I don't see a request to do that. Oh, okay.
sorry to put you on the spot, Erin.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I don't know, the video can't come on. So yeah, I didn't mean to hop in there. I just wanted to add a little bit. I guess what I was saying about the NRCS programs is we are not focusing on conservation reserve in terms of taking anything out of production or even driving, you know, Kernza as a strictly conservation crop because we want it to be a production crop. And so we're really looking at those programs that have, you know, the ability for farmers to apply for cost share for certain practices, and those sit in the conservation stewardship program, the CSP, and the EQIP. And we're really trying to build some of those kind of, you know, toeholds within those practices that can kind of straddle, like saying, look, even though this is a crop for production for market, they do have these conservation benefits. And we have had this big exciting thing happen where on the federal level, they wrote in perennial grains to a conservation crop rotation practice. It's 328 if anybody wants to see that. And what that does is it opens up, like we're getting the environmental quality by all the things that Jessica was, you know, talking about, but that farmers can actually apply, you know, and hopefully be accepted and hopefully get the cost share for adoption of a production crop. And the reason I'm bringing that up is often when we speak to NRCS staff, they'll say, hey, we don't help farmers grow corn. So we're in this really, right, we're trying to develop a very different, you know, agriculture, like Jessica was sharing, kind of those sustainable intensification. And so we have to straddle what are those conservation programs really developed for, and what are we trying to do in both producing some kind of new crop and getting those environmental benefits. And yeah, I can leave it there. So thanks. I don't know if that helped.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I had a question. I'm coming at this sort of from totally left field, not really being a plant breeder at all. I'm sort of plant breeder adjacent, but
Yeah, me too.
It strikes me that, there are going to be unique issues with perennial crops, especially something that's going to be in this agronomic setting. And I'm sort of wondering if you could speak to some of the challenges that have come up. I'm sure in a public setting, that is not a great topic to bring out, since you're interested in trying to get this out and adopted and set up all these systems. But I would think it would be of value to people that are interested in plant improvement generally to consider what sort of new challenges are coming up with a agronomic crop species that's has the perennial trait. I mean, I'd imagine weeds are going to be a colossal issue with this compared to annual systems where you can plow everything. And I don't know. I'll stop talking. And
Yeah. I think there are a lot of challenges, and I think I'm even more than crop breeder adjacent. Like I'm telling like a bit of my own story, but I'm kind of telling like 80 other people's stories today. So over time, weeds aren't a big issue, but they are in the first year. And so keeping weeds down in the establishment year is not untrivial if you want to get good establishment. And so, I mean, a nice thing about Kernza is that it's even in the very beginning, it starts wiggling those little roots down. And so you can like rip out weeds. I mean, you don't want to do it by hand, but you can, so getting it established is important. After that, it seems to start to deal with weeds pretty well, which is kind of some of the point, right? The biggest challenge so far that I did not talk at all about, and I am remiss in doing so, is the yield decline. And so there has been this, I showed this great yield increase with varieties, but most current varieties, at least in Minnesota, decline in yields dramatically after the third year, and sometimes even after the second year. It seems like in Kansas at the Land Institute or some other places, they don't see that quite to the degree that we do here, but that's all kind of data in progress. And so, yeah, so how do you tell someone that something is perennial and it's not going to give them grain after 3 years?
Well, that's been the case. I know I was looking
Yeah.
into essential oil crops, and oftentimes mints, for example, will be super vigorous, and you can get them to produce lots of flowers and leaf tissues initially, but then after about 2 or 3 seasons, you pretty much have to go through and actually plow strips through your field in order to be able to reinvigorate the crop. There's something, I mean, presumably something similar is going on in this case where you've got.
Yeah, that's it. It definitely, I think every breeding line, they're looking at yields beyond 3 years. So they're tackling it from a genetics and breeding point of view. But yeah, there also has been a lot of work on agronomic practices. Part of it is that almost in the spirit of the dual use I was mentioning, like if you defoliate in the spring or you defoliate in the fall or both, and in year 1 or 2, I actually was just looking at data on this yesterday. In the first couple of years, that seems to help and you get some yield improvements, but that doesn't seem to be a remarkable change. And also, yeah, like either tilling or burning in between rows to reinvigorate, like are all things that people are trying. So, how widely of rows do you plant? So the row spacing has been part of the conversation too. And so there's been a lot of work on that. I don't know if anyone has found something that has really changed the game on that story yet, but that's definitely, like, the yield longevity is a huge piece of it. The other piece of it though, back to that figure I was showing, is that is just adapting to it as it is now. And so actually a project that just got wrapped up was organic transitions project. So, okay, it yields it well for a couple of years. Would this be a good option during the organic transition for farmers to be able to improve the economics during the transition from conventional to organic? A lot of the producers we work with are, who already have or are interested in diversifying their cropping systems, will replace a small grain with it. And so they'll be so you'll plant it for a couple of years in your rotation to replace another small grain crop. So those are some of the strategies to cope with it while everyone is very, very busy figuring out how to make the yields last longer.
I suppose it'll also be interesting to see what new pests emerge once you start to grow lots of this on the landscape.
Yeah. Yes, that's another challenge. You want to hear about challenges? So I forget what this stands for, but mycotoxin, the DON levels is something that we've started having conversation about because like there's so little grain in the world already that how do you kind of deal with that is a topic of conversation. Like it's a toxin that is really hard to deal with or get rid of, but we've been having conversations about that in other commodity crops, like an annual wheat. One of the strategies is to dilute it. And so if you have one lot that is high in DON, you can mix it in with the other lots and still come out with, a percentage that's allowable for food grade. And also, like, can you use those Kernza grain lots with high DON for other uses that are not food grade? Like that's already an emerging pest. So far it has been relatively pest free, but yeah,
Mhm.
we know that that will not last forever. So
Looks like we've got another question. We've got
Yeah.
a question online from Gary Gardner. Biomass seems to be constant over 3 years, but harvest index declines. That's not really a question,
yeah, that does, I agree. That
but
doesn't seem to be.
but an
Yes,
observation.
yes, that
Okay.
is true.
Can you comment on that or?
Yeah, yeah, that's correct. So it's the harvest. Yeah. So the grain produced is what declines, not the biomass of the plant. And I think your thinking has been really similar to a lot of, Adrian has been a lot of similar to other people's thinking, that it's actually the biomass is producing too well and it's starting to fill in and get, and have, like, not compete with itself, but almost to the point that the vegetative biomass is so healthy that it stops producing seeds.
Okay.
Which is what a reasonable untamed plant would do.
Yeah.
If you're growing well, why invest in reproduction?
Yes. So
So-
we've got about 2 minutes left. Are there any other questions in the room or online? There's, if you jump to it, we can try to entertain it.
Do you have a question? No. I think we're good in the room.
Okay. I've got more questions, but I'll seek you out some other time because I'm sure people are tired of hearing me ask questions.
You've only asked one question.
Oh.
But yes, we could let people go. And yeah, and if I said I didn't flash up my name, my email, but I'll put my email in the chat for anyone else to feel free to reach out to me.
Okay, we can, I think Kelsey can provide your contact information, and typically these are recorded as well. So everyone in the department will be able to see this again and also get your contact information from the department newsletter. So
Perfect.
so thank you very much. And I guess, I don't know, Julie, do you have a few words to say from the room?
I was gonna say thank you to the room, and we'll give a round of applause.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks a lot for having me. It was nice to kind of, share some of the ideas that, it's a big group, but a lot of us think very intensely about these issues. So it's nice to kind of get it out to other audiences and get feedback and thoughts. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Cool, thank you.